Okay, I think I think we're finally live. Sorry to be late, y'all. I was having some technical difficulties and things were not working as they were intended to. But it looks like we're good now. So, welcome everybody to the MudRoom, our weekly free and live Uncommon Sense parenting class. It's good to see everyone again. I know last week was hard for everyone. It feels really weird to be just getting back into the swing of things, and I considered skipping this week too, but I consulted with my various advisors who were kind enough to check me and share their perspectives with me, and the unanimous advice that I got was to continue on, but to make it clear that the work isn't done, and it isn't. It never will be. Last week, I know many of us attended the webinar that I shared by Embrace Race on how to make sure that we don't raise the next Amy Cooper, and I know a ton of you signed up. I also know that not everybody who signed up was able to get in because there were way more registrations than there were seats, which is awesome. But if you weren't able to attend live, I really encourage you to go and spend the hour watching the replay that is posted on their website. It was a fantastic discussion. I found it very empowering. I got some new tools to put in my toolbox, so I can't recommend it enough. But I also want to encourage you that if you do go watch it, that you also support Embrace Race with a financial donation. Teaching and creating content is very expensive, both energetically and financially. Producing the MudRoom costs well over $1,000 a month, so I can only imagine the costs of an organization like Embrace Race has. If you're consuming their content, if their content is helping you navigate this time, please make sure that you show your appreciation by supporting them financially. And because I just personally don't feel ready to move on. That isn't really the right way to say that, but I can't think of better wording right now. I'm not ready to talk about something else right now. Our topic tonight is kind of pulled from that webinar. It was touched on there, but I've also have hundreds of emails over the last week asking about this, so I think this is a great topic to kind of get us back into the swing of things, but not go right back to business as usual. And that's how young is too young to be talking to kids about race. We've talked about what I call the roots of isms before, and why children develop prejudices against differences, and the reason the whole, color blindness thing was a theoretical good intention that failed spectacularly. Actually, I think it was about a year ago that I recorded that episode. And I encourage you to go listen to it once we're done here, because it will puzzle well with this episode. And I'll drop a link in the comments once we're done. Before we get into it though, allow me to introduce myself. If we haven't met yet, hi. I'm Allana Robinson, and I'm a parenting coach for parents of toddlers, preschoolers, and kindergartners. I help parents understand why their children are misbehaving and how to fix it without yelling, shaming, or timeouts. I'm your host here on the MudRoom. I also host the Parenting Posse Facebook group, and I host the Parentability program. If you're watching, please say hi. Let me know how you're doing. If you're watching a replay in the comments. Don't forget to like the video if you're watching us on Facebook. If you're listening to us on the podcast and you enjoy the MudRoom, I'd be really thrilled if you would post a review. Don't be shy. Please comment and ask questions as we go along. It really enhances the discussion, and I love chatting with y'all. All right, so let's get into it. So when is it appropriate to start discussing race with children? First of all, I want to point out that I did a little bit of sleuthing, a little bit of digging, and all evidence points to it being only white families that have asked me this question. And I know that most of my audience are white families, but even though white families are the demographic majority, my audience certainly isn't exclusively white families. But from what I can tell, it's only white families who've asked this, which I think is really telling. Black, Indigenous, people of color parents don't have the luxury of asking this question because it's just kind of something that comes up as a matter of course in their day-to-day lives. And therein, I think, lies a large part of the anxiety, of the hesitation, and of the uncertainty for white parents. When white parents think of talking to their kids about race, we envision this big family-style sit-down discussion, like it's this familial town hall we have to have, and then we can check off the box on our mental parenting checklist for, okay, had the race discussion. Similarly to how historically parents have approached talking to their kids about gender differences and sex and then checked off a mental box for, okay, had the sex discussion. But something that millennial parents have, at least as far as I can tell, seem to have come to understand is that shrouding the topic of sex in mystery and then having this big reveal doesn't really work. And it scars children, and it makes them feel awkward and unsafe and puts them on the spot. So what I'd argue most millennial parents do is we start talking about it very casually from a young age and a very developmentally appropriate level, and we build on it as they have more questions and as they need more information. But for some reason, we haven't generalized this lesson to race discussions. When people say they think a toddler is too young to talk about race, what I find that they really mean is that I can't have a big conversation about race with my 2-year-old. They aren't going to get it, and they're not going to sit and listen. And I mean, duh, right? 4-year-old can only sit and listen to someone talk for about 10 minutes max. And that's with like pulling out all the stops and having props and shit. Of course, your 2-year-old can't have an hour-long family meeting about race. And of course, you're not going to be able to explain systemic oppression to a 2-year-old. They're barely aware of the systems that very tangibly run their daily lives. But nobody's asking you to do that. When people say that it's never too young to start talking about race with children, they mean at a developmentally appropriate level. Like, a developmentally appropriate discussion about sex with a toddler is, I don't have a penis like you do, I have a vulva. Boom, you just had a sex discussion with a toddler. A developmentally appropriate race discussion with a toddler is, yes, you are right, that little boy's skin is a different color than yours. Boom, you just had a race discussion with a toddler. And when you have small discussions like that and add just a bit more information each time, it becomes much, much more manageable. And the evidence is that it is much more effective because everybody stays calm. We've talked a lot about how when you're hyper-aroused, your brain loses contact with the area that controls language. And that's also the area that controls your reason and knowledge. So by psyching ourselves up for these big conversations, we actually make it harder on ourselves, and our children sense that we've gotten ourselves all worked up. So then they're not using their neocortex either. And what good does that do anyone? It doesn't. In fact, it's actually doing the opposite of what we'd hoped because they sense that we're uncomfortable. So their brain goes, oh, mom seems to be very uncomfortable with this topic. Danger, we're going to avoid this. And that's not the vibe that we're going for here. Oh, for some reason, my computer is dying. One hot second. What is going on over here? There we go. Sorry about that. We just got back from visiting my parents for the weekend, and I guess I didn't push the plug in all the way. I didn't want to get cut off right in the middle. Patty says, thanks for starting with that point. The first time I witnessed my black daughter experiencing racism was the first time we went into a store together ever. She was 10 days old. Yeah, and I know, like, it's not something that families of color, I'm not sure if that's the right way to say that. Someone correct me if it's not. It makes logical sense to me, though, that's why I said it. I don't think that's something that families of color get to avoid, or they get to wait on, right? That's not the vibe that we want to go for, is that this is a dangerous topic and therefore needs to be avoided. So we want to make sure that we're not giving off that feeling, and our children can feel our emotions, right? They can sense how what we're talking about makes us nervous or makes us feel unsure. And if so, they're going to pick that up, and they're going to want to avoid that topic, not the vibe we want to go for. Keeping it short and sweet and in little chunks every single day also gives them a chance to process and ask questions. It allows them to guide the conversation. So for instance, this past week I asked my kids, who are currently 4 and 6, if they knew what a protest was. And just because I wanted to know where we were starting from here, or not starting from, but where I was starting this particular topic or this angle of the topic with them. And both of them were like, nope. Actually, my 4-year-old thought I said prostate. Because we have had quite frequent sex discussions and anatomy discussions. So they both said no. So I just explained what it was. And they were both like, cool. And then they walked away. They were kind of like, interesting. Just one small conversation. And then later that day, my 6-year-old came to me and he was like, why did you tell us what a protest is? And I explained that right now, Black people don't feel safe and that they don't think that's fair. So they're protesting to let non-Black people know that we'd stop making them feel unsafe. Super simplified, right? But that's the level a 6-year-old and a 4-year-old need it on. If you were talking to a 3-year-old, you would even distill it a little bit more. And he was like, okay. And then he ran off and he told his 4-year-old brother. And that was the end of that conversation, okay? So now we've had 2 small conversations in one day. And then 2 days later, we were in the car and we were driving to my mom. And he asked me, okay, so Mom, you know how you were telling me that Black people are protesting because they don't feel safe? And I was like, yep. And he was like, so why don't they feel safe? So I explained more, and his immediate reaction was, that's not good. And then we had a bit of back and forth where he asked some questions about specifics. I answered them. The 4-year-old, who I didn't think was listening, took his headphones off and piped in with, my friend so-and-so is Black, right? I'm not going to say his name for privacy reasons, but I just confirmed, yes, he is in fact Black. And then he added in, I want him to feel safe. I love him. And I was like, I want him to feel safe too. And so then I introduced the idea that it's important that if someone is bugging a Black child, that they stick around and protect them. And they were like, cool. And then they went quiet and we continued our drive. And then a couple days later on our drive home, my oldest said, Mom, I don't hate Black people. All the Black people I know are nice. I was like, me too. And then he asked why we don't see one of my adult Black friends anymore, which surprised me because we haven't seen her since he was like 18 months old because we moved. And I wasn't really expecting him to remember her at all, but he did, and he was clearly trying to make a connection there. So I explained that we don't see her anymore because we moved away. She lives far away now. It has nothing to do with her being Black. Her and I still talk on Instagram and Facebook. We're still friends. We will see her when we go back there next summer. And he just kind of nodded and went quiet again. So now I'm waiting to see where he takes this next, where they both take it next. And if they don't initiate again, then I'll initiate again. And my just heard 4-year-old has been much less vocal about this. He has been present for almost all of it. And he has asked quite a few questions of his own, mostly in relation to his friend who is Black. But that's, again, very developmentally appropriate for a 4-year-old, right? They're very egocentric, so they're going to try and connect it to what they know. And I have to admit that if it was just my 4-year-old, I would probably have to be initiating a bit more. Not necessarily because he's 4, but just because he's not as chatty as his brother in general. But we'll keep having these small, everyday conversations and giving them lots of time to process it and to think of what information they're missing and ask for it. And we'll seize on the opportunities afforded by books and media and interactions with their non-white friends and things that they hear people say. That's what talking about racism with young kids needs to look like. Not these huge family meeting style sit-downs. But you need to do it. You need to initiate it. You need to ask them questions. If you don't know what they know, ask. That's why I asked, do you know what a protest is? Before I launched into an explanation about what a protest is, because if they knew, then that would have given me a different avenue into that conversation. They didn't, so I explained it. And to actively give them something to chew and think about. And you need to be really intentional about it, because part of the privilege of being white is that these opportunities tend to not force themselves on us the same way that they do for families of color. We don't have to do it by necessity. It requires us to be conscious of it, to do our own education first so that we're ready and we have some answers for them, and to actively seek out opportunities to have the conversations. And as they get older and their questions will inevitably get more detailed and complex, we can start including them in finding out the answers. But we shouldn't let not knowing all the answers prevent you from starting the conversation, because that will stick you in a holding pattern. If you're a white person, you're never going to know enough. You're always going to have unknowns. But it is perfectly acceptable to say to your child, I don't know, but I'll find out. Or as they get to be more school-aged, I don't know, let's look it up. You're never going to be an expert on racism. So don't use that as an excuse to not take action. And that was one of the biggest takeaways for me from the Embrace Race webinar. Melissa Giroux, one of the founders, likened it to learning to garden, that you can read all about plants, you can buy seeds, you can buy expensive water systems, etc., etc. But if you never actually put your trowel in the dirt, you're never going to grow anything. And yes, chances are you're going to screw up somewhere along the way. But you can always learn more. You can always apply new lessons. Raising anti-racist kids is something you have to kind of just start and then course correct as you go. Otherwise, you get stuck just in a loop of educating yourself and never doing anything. And it's the doing part that's important. So all of that to say, no, your kids aren't too young to talk about race. They're too young to have a huge sit-down family town hall style conversation about race. But they are not too young to be introduced to the concept or to start the conversation about it at a developmentally appropriate level. And in fact, by breaking it down in chunks like that and talking about it more frequently, more consistently, it works better with how our brains process information and therefore is more likely to be effective and to stick. So, what do you all think? If you attended the Embrace Race webinar last week, what were your big takeaways? Do you have some ideas of how to open this conversation and keep it going with your young kids? Does it feel a little bit less overwhelming now? Are you committed to not just listening, but to getting off your rump and actually doing it? Because that's what's important. And I'd really love to continue this conversation in the Parenting Posse. Just remember that we moderate the group heavily. We're not going to tolerate any racist bullshit. We won't give you any warning. We won't just mute you. You will be booted swiftly if you can't operate within our community standards. And if a person of color decides to take the time to educate you, thank them and listen. I've personally been kind of shocked. I have yet to need to boot anyone from the posse over a race issue this past week. Many of my colleagues have had to do like a very deep sweep of their email lists and of their groups. I haven't. I don't think I've actually had to boot anyone over a race issue in over a year now. If you make me break that streak, I will be pissed. I have been super proud about how my community has conducted itself this past week. So if you want to keep talking and you aren't already part of the group, you can find the link in the description. You are more than welcome to join us. Just make sure that you're keeping it between the ditches. All right. Thank you so much for joining me tonight. Just a quick reminder that the MudRoom is moving our time slot to Wednesdays at 1 p.m. Eastern starting in July. So we have 3 more weeks in this time slot, and then that's it. So, Y'all are quiet tonight. No comments. That's it. I'll see you next week for another Uncommon Sense parenting class. Bye.